swollen from decades of damp, its nails blackened with rust. The men who had hauled it from the cellar of the abandoned townhouse on Broad Street would later swear that something breathed inside it, though the box had lain untouched since before the first shots at Fort Sumter. They forced the lid back with a crowbar, expecting perhaps old china, a forgotten ledger, or some relic left behind when the house changed hands after the war. Instead, the lantern light fell upon a bundle wrapped in oil-stiffened canvas, tied in a sailor's knot and sealed with a strip of fraying blue ribbon. The foreman hesitated. The others drew closer. When they cut through the layers, an object rolled free, an iron collar, heavy as a millstone, shaped not for punishment but for capture. Its surface bore strange etchings, crude symbols, half runes, half tallies, scored in uneven strokes, as if carved by different hands over many years. Inside the ring, faintly visible beneath a crust of corrosion, lay a name, or at least the ghost of one. L. Something indistinguishable. And the date, 1843. But the thing that chilled the room to silence was not the collar itself. It was the second bundle that slid out after it, an account book, bound in cracked calfskin, filled with the brittle handwriting of Charleston slave merchants. There were purchase records, ship manifests, and entries noting temperament, labor skill, and expected lifespan. Yet one listing had been struck through in 2 violent strokes, as though the ink could not be permitted to exist. And still the name beneath the scarred lines bled through to the page, a dark whisper older than the house, older than the war, older perhaps than the men who first wrote it. It read, male, 18 to 20 years, height exceptional, strength abnormal, sold under duress, warning, extremely dangerous. Beside those words, a final notation. Confined pending disposal. Do not unchain. If the crate had contained only this collar and this ledger, it would already have been a story worthy of fear. But tucked behind the pages was something far worse. A folded broadsheet from 1843, brittle as autumn leaves, announcing a series of unexplained deaths along the Cooper River shortly after the sale of an unnamed enslaved man to one of Charleston's most powerful families. The article had been clipped out with scissors, leaving only torn edges behind, as if someone had removed the part of the story they feared most. The ledger, the collar, the torn newspaper, these were the seeds of a mystery nearly 2 centuries old, a mystery buried beneath wealth, reputation, and the brutal machinery of the slave trade, a mystery that began with a single sale in the Charleston market and ended, if one believes the rumors, in blood, madness, and whispered rituals practiced behind shuttered windows. Before we continue with the story of the impossible mystery surrounding the most dangerous enslaved man ever sold in Charleston, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. Charleston, in the year 1843, was a city of contradictions, glittering wealth rising above foundations soaked in human misery. Tall houses of pale stucco and wrought iron balconies lined Meeting Street, while enormous live oaks spread their limbs across graveyards older than the Republic itself. The streets carried the scent of salt from the harbor, but also the thick, sweet rot of rice plantations downstream. At dawn, the air filled with the clanging of ship bells, the creak of rope, and the distant hymns drifting from the city's many churches. By dusk, it carried the murmurs from taverns, the shuffle of chains at the workhouses, and the scratch of quills behind counting-house doors. The institution of slavery permeated every inch of Charleston life, woven into the rhythm of commerce and the cadence of prayer. Merchants tracked human beings as ledger entries. Ministers spoke of obedience from their pulpits. Families built dynasties on the backs of those who had no voice, no rights, and no refuge beyond the mercy of their owners. Yet beneath this carefully maintained facade lingered unrest, an invisible tremor left behind by the memory of Denmark Vesey's aborted rebellion 2 decades earlier. Vigilance committees patrolled the streets at night, their lanterns flickering across the cobblestones like restless spirits. Rumors persisted of secret gatherings among the enslaved, coded songs carrying messages, strange lights flickering across the marshes on moonless nights. It was a time when fear walked beside pride, and suspicion hung over the city like a low storm cloud. The slave market itself stood near the intersection of Chalmers and State, a place where the cries of auctioneers rose above the heat like crows circling a battlefield. The stones beneath their feet were smooth from years of shuffling bodies, and the smell of sweat mingled with the sharper tang of salt water from the nearby wharves. In 1843, sales were brisk. Rice and cotton demanded endless labor, and ship captains arriving from Africa, Cuba, and New Orleans supplied a steady stream of human cargo. Some documented, others smuggled, all evaluated like livestock. Buyers and sellers argued over muscle tone, scars, age, and temperament. Sometimes voices broke into heated quarrels. Sometimes the crowd parted silently when a chained line of newly arrived captives staggered past, eyes hollow, legs trembling. Yet, even in a place defined by suffering, some sales whispered through the crowds with heavier shadows than others. Slavers, hardened by years of cruelty, sometimes refused to handle certain individuals, calling them cursed, marked, doomed, touched by something beyond reason. Most of these tales were dismissed as superstition, but they lingered in the corners of conversations like a lingering draft through a cracked door. 1843 was also the year Charleston's elite families consolidated unprecedented political power. The Rutledges, the Pinckneys, the Middletons, names carved into courthouses and churches, moved money quietly between banks, plantations, and international traders. A handful of these families even funded expeditions to West Africa, seeking agricultural knowledge or new supply routes. Their wealth shielded them from scrutiny, even when their dealings drifted into the illegal. It was into this world, this conflicted, feverish, gilded, and grim America, that the figure from the ledger emerged. A man whose name has been lost or deliberately erased. A man whose sale was whispered about long before any official record captured his existence. According to fragments of diaries from the period, he arrived not through the ordinary channels of the domestic slave trade, but under circumstances so unusual that several dock workers refused to document the landing. Some said he had been found alone on a derelict ship drifting near Sullivan's Island, its crew missing, its deck smeared with old blood but showing no signs of struggle. Others claimed he walked out of the marsh at twilight, barefoot, wild-eyed, speaking a language not heard in decades. Those who told this version insisted that the Vigilance Committee captured him only after 3 of their men were injured trying to restrain him. Whatever the truth, he was brought in chains to the market, chains thicker than ordinary, chains usually reserved for prisoners during transport, and from the moment he appeared, a hush fell over the crowd. Buyers stepped back. Sellers muttered under their breath. Several women pulled their children away, whispering prayers under their shawls. A plantation overseer allegedly remarked, "That one ain't meant for the fields. That one belongs underground." No official document confirms the remark, but the ledger found in the crate, scrawled in a hurried, anxious hand, supports the sentiment. His assessment reads unlike any other record of the time. No mention of crop skill, no evaluation of temperament beyond that single word: dangerous. Charleston's economy thrived on order, predictability, and cruelty masked as commerce. Anything unpredictable threatened not only property, but pride. And when a man like this arrived, quiet, enormous, restrained with iron meant for beasts, whispers multiplied faster than the city's gas lamps could chase shadows. Some believed he had been involved in a mutiny on a slave ship. Others thought he had murdered his owner in another state and fled south. A few more superstitious townsfolk murmured that he carried an old curse from the African interior, something tied to ancient rites the missionaries failed to extinguish. Yet, amid all these rumors, one fact stood clear. Someone with substantial wealth purchased him, paid a sum far above market value, and arranged for immediate transport to a secluded property upriver, away from prying eyes. A sale like that should have attracted scrutiny, but Charleston had learned, long before 1843, that certain families were never to be questioned. The roads that wound from the city toward the plantations were dusty in summer and treacherous in winter, lined with cypress trees whose trunks twisted like knotted limbs reaching from the earth. Smoke from rice burns often drifted across the riverbank, dimming the sun and leaving the air thick with the acrid scent of damp straw. Travelers sometimes reported strange cries echoing from the marshes, birds, perhaps, or something else carried on the wind. Those were the roads down which the purchased man was taken, his wrists bound, his eyes forward, his breath steady despite the weight of the iron collar. The driver who transported him later told his wife, "I've hauled many a man in chains, but never one who looked at me like he already knew where I was taking him. Knew and didn't care." No one wrote his true name. No one recorded his birthplace. All that remains are rumors, scratched-out ledger entries, and artifacts sealed in a crate, as though someone feared what would happen if they were ever found. But Charleston remembers things, even when it pretends to forget. Secrets seep into the wood of its oldest buildings, into the river mud, into the tidewater that rises and falls like a restless heartbeat. And sometimes, when enough years have passed, those secrets claw their way back to the surface, in the form of iron, ink, and a story waiting to be told. The first figure history allows us to see clearly through the haze of Charleston's past is a man named Silas Calder, though few spoke his name aloud after the events of that year. In 1843, he was 39, small in stature but sharp as wire, a broker whose livelihood depended on the trade that kept the city's wealth flowing. His hair, prematurely silver at the temples, gave him an appearance of dignity he did not entirely deserve. Silas handled human bodies the way a jeweler handled stones, turning them, weighing them, calculating their flaws. Yet he was not cruel in the overt way overseers were. His cruelty was quiet, like a locked drawer in the back of his mind. He avoided looking his clients in the eye longer than necessary, preferring to speak numbers instead of names. People said he walked too quickly, as though always trying to escape his own shadow. He kept his collars stiff, his ledgers immaculate, and his conscience out of sight. And still, those who knew him swore there was something brittle beneath the man's hurried politeness, as though a single wrong turn in business might shatter him completely. The morning the dangerous man arrived at the market, Silas was already on edge. His wife Maria had risen early, leaning in the doorway with a shawl around her shoulders as he prepared to leave. "Silas," she whispered, her voice coated with worry. "I had the dream again, the one with the knocking." He tightened his gloves, refusing to meet her gaze. "Dreams are no more than the body's misfires, Maria. Pay them no mind." "But it wasn't the same as before," she insisted. "Someone was knocking from inside the house." Silas sighed and kissed her forehead. "There is no inside to fear but our own thoughts." Yet, as he walked toward the market, he could not shake the unease her words placed on him like a second, invisible coat. By the time he reached Chalmers Street, the murmurs had already begun. Buyers gathered like frightened birds, stepping back from the newly arrived prisoner as if his presence carried heat. Silas approached him with professional detachment. But the moment his eyes met the man's, something broke in that carefully arranged mind of his. The man stood perfectly still, taller than any Silas had ever sold, his muscles coiled but relaxed, as though the chains binding him were ceremonial rather than functional. His skin bore scars not of the whip, but of something older, symbols etched with precision, like the marks left by ceremonial blades. His face held no expression at all, not anger, not fear, only depth, as though he were observing a world that had no power over him. Silas took a shaky breath. "Can he speak?" One of the handlers shook his head. "Not to any of us." "Has he tried?" A pause. "He made a sound. Last night. Didn't seem human." Silas swallowed hard. He had conducted thousands of evaluations, but this one slipped through his fingers like water refusing to be held. The man looked at him as Maria had described,
thousands of
like someone knocking from inside a place Silas did not wish to open. When the buyer stepped forward, a representative of one of Charleston's most influential families, Silas allowed the sale to proceed without a single question. He recorded the basic details, sealed the ledger, and never spoke of that morning again. But at night, Maria would later testify, she sometimes awoke to find Silas sitting upright in the dark, muttering fragments of scripture under his breath as though trying to patch cracks in his faith. Another figure central to the mystery was Reverend Josiah Bellwether, a man whose sermons could shake rafters and lift spirits, but could not quiet the tremor that lived behind his own ribs. In 1843, he was 51, tall and gaunt, with fingers long enough to seem skeletal when he raised them for blessing. His church, St. Alister's on Broad Street, welcomed the wealthy in polished pews and sent missionaries to the plantations, though the Reverend himself rarely left the city limits. He had once been a scholar of ancient languages before turning to theology, and some whispered that he knew things no pastor should know. Things found in dust-ridden volumes beneath European monasteries, things better left untranslated. Bellwether believed in absolute order, God above man, man above woman, master above slave. Yet beneath that rigid framework flickered a candle of genuine compassion, threatening to undo the structure he relied upon. Those under his ministry said the Reverend often paused mid-sermon, as though listening to something no one else heard. He dismissed such accounts, claiming he merely pondered scripture, but the truth lingered in his eyes. He feared something, and that fear had been growing for years. His first involvement in the affair came the week after the sale. A plantation owner, whose name has been redacted in several versions of the story, summoned him urgently. Bellwether arrived in the early morning, the fog so thick he could barely see the path. The owner met him at the gate, pale as linen. "Reverend," he said, voice cracking, "I need prayer in this house. Something wicked has entered it." Bellwether stiffened. Wickedness enters through the heart, not the door. The man shook his head violently. "This is not of man. It came with the one we purchased." Bellwether followed him inside, the wooden floors groaning under their feet. Something about the air bothered him. Too cold for summer, too still for dawn. As they passed the parlor, a whisper of wind stroked his ear like a fingernail dragging across fabric. He turned sharply. The curtains hung motionless. "Where is he kept?" the Reverend asked. "In the storage house for now. Reverend, he hasn't eaten in 2 days. He hasn't spoken. He just stands there." "And why call me?" The owner swallowed. "Last night, the dogs wouldn't go near the place. Then one started howling. Then it stopped, too suddenly." Bellwether approached the storage building alone, lifting his lantern as he stepped inside. The man stood in the center of the room, still chained, his silhouette massive against the dim light. But it wasn't the man that made Bellwether's breath falter. It was the sensation that the air bent around him, as though he occupied more space than his body contained. Bellwether cleared his throat. "Son, do you understand me?" The man slowly lifted his head. Bellwether felt his voice betray him. "You are not beyond God's reach." The man's first sound since arriving in Charleston drifted from his throat. Not a word, but a tremor, a low resonance that vibrated through the boards beneath the Reverend's boots. It was not anger, not pain, not chant. Something older, something Bellwether recognized from the margins of texts he wished he had never read. He staggered backward, clutching the doorframe. The plantation owner rushed forward. "What did he say?" Bellwether wiped cold sweat from his brow. "Not a word, but it was a prayer." "A prayer." Bellwether stared into the dim room as the man lowered his head once more. "Yes, but not to any god we know." From that moment, the Reverend involved himself relentlessly, visiting the property every week, insisting on private prayers, though he emerged each time more shaken. His assistant once overheard him whisper late at night, "If there is a boundary between the holy and the profane, that man stands with 1 foot beyond it." Yet, not all voices in this story belong to men with authority. Among the enslaved on that same plantation was a woman named Lila, whose testimony, recorded decades later by abolitionists, offers a rare glimpse from within the shadows. Lila was 20 when the dangerous man arrived, small but fiercely built, with eyes that seemed always to measure the room before stepping fully inside it. She had grown up along the riverbanks and understood the marshes better than many overseers. She also possessed a quiet intuition, the kind passed from mother to daughter long before written history. Lila recalled the first time she saw him. "He weren't like other men," she told her interviewer. "He looked at the ground like he was listening to it breathe." One night, while carrying water to the quarters, she passed the storage house and paused. Something urged her closer. "Sir," she whispered through the cracks in the boards. "You hungry?" Silence. She waited. Then, softly, "You should not speak here." Lila nearly dropped her pail. His voice was low, steady, and strangely calm. She whispered, "Why?" The chain shifted. "Because they are listening." She backed away slowly, not sure whether he meant the masters or something else entirely. Lila's encounters with him remained few, but she carried the memory with a reverence touched by dread. "He ain't talked like no man I ever knew," she testified. "Every word sounded like it was weighed before he spoke it, like he had to decide if we was ready to hear it." These three, Silas Calder, Reverend Bellwether, and Lila, stood at different corners of Charleston society, bound only by the presence of the man the ledger called dangerous. Through their eyes, the tapestry of dread began to unfold. And though none of them yet understood it, the true horror had only just set its first footprints in the soil of 1843. The first signs began quietly, like hairline fractures running beneath a polished floor, subtle enough to ignore, yet unmistakable once the light caught them. On the plantation where the dangerous man had been taken, the routines of daily life slipped out of rhythm. Nothing dramatic at first, nothing that a ledger or overseer's report would have captured. But Lila noticed them, and so did others. The birds that usually gathered near the rice fields at dawn began avoiding the storage house entirely, circling wide as though the air around it had turned sour. The dogs, once restless and eager to prowl, refused to approach its door, whining and pulling against their chains. One evening, Lila stood at the pump, drawing water as the last sliver of sun sank behind the cypress trees. The world grew dim with a suddenness that belongs only to summer nights in the South. She strained to hear the usual chorus of insects rising from the marsh, the hum, the buzz, the soft clicking of unseen wings, but instead, she heard nothing, an entire landscape holding its breath. She stepped back, uneasy. Silence was a stranger there. From inside the storage house came a faint metallic sound, almost rhythmic, like a pendulum brushing the sides of a clock. Lila's fingers tightened around the handle of her bucket. She whispered into the dark, "Who's in there with you?" The noise stopped. Then his voice, low but clear enough to find her through the cracks. "No one." The next morning, one of the overseers discovered deep scratches gouged into the doorframe of the storage building. They were not claw marks. They ran straight and parallel, as if carved by a knife held in a steady hand. But the man in chains had no blade, and he had not been unshackled since his arrival. The overseer blamed one of the laborers, accusing them of trying to frighten the master's family. Lila stood among the workers as he shouted, his face red with drink, but she knew no one had gone near the building. She kept her gaze down, letting the accusation pass over her, though her heart beat heavily with the truth. She had heard the scratches being made, not by metal against wood, but by something deeper, something deliberate. 3 nights later, the plantation's eldest field hand, Jonah, vanished. Jonah was respected among the enslaved, soft-spoken, steady, a storyteller with a voice that soothed even the children who cried themselves to sleep. He had lived through hurricanes, floods, and overseers crueler than wolves. But he never went anywhere without telling someone first. The night he disappeared, he had been on watch near the outer fields, holding his lantern and humming a familiar hymn. By dawn, only the lantern remained, lying extinguished in the mud. The glass was cracked, not shattered, as if something had pressed it gently before letting it fall. When the master questioned Lila, she reported only what she had heard. "Did Jonah speak to anyone before he disappeared?" he demanded. "No, sir. He just went quiet." "Quiet? What do you mean?" The hymn stopped. The dogs stopped barking. Even the frogs went still. The master stiffened. "That's nonsense, girl. Creatures don't fall silent on command." She held his gaze, something she rarely dared. "No, sir, not unless something make 'em." The master dismissed her, but his hands trembled when he shut the door. Rumors traveled quickly among the enslaved, though they spoke only in whispers while cooking or tending the grounds. Some said Jonah had been taken by river spirits that lived beneath the marsh. Others believed the dangerous man had called him somehow, using music no human ear could hear. Lila rejected both ideas at first, until the night she passed the storage building again and heard a second voice inside, a soft, strained murmur. Jonah's voice. Her breath caught. She stepped closer, pressing her ear against the wood. "Jonah?" she whispered. Silence. Then the man spoke, smooth and terrible in its calm. "He is gone." She swallowed. "Gone where?" "To a place he feared more than hunger, but less than living." Lila backed away slowly, her knees weakening. "You did something to him." The chain rattled faintly. "No, I opened nothing, I closed nothing. The path he took was already in him." The following Sunday, Reverend Bellwether stood before his congregation at St. Alistair's, palms braced against the pulpit. His voice boomed through the sanctuary, but something about it quivered at the edges, as though his lungs held less certainty than his words. "There are forces," he declared, "that move unseen among us. Forces that test the soul, not with temptation, but with revelation. When order is disturbed, when nature itself recoils, we must ask what door has been opened." A murmur rippled through the pews. The elite family shifted uncomfortably, sensing his sermon was not mere theology, but a warning. After the service, one of the wealthier parishioners approached him. "Reverend, your message was unusual." Bellwether offered a strained smile. "The times require unusual vigilance." "You mean the rumors circulating about that new slave?" The reverend stiffened. "I mean only that man should guard his heart when confronted with the inexplicable." He left without another word, but his assistant later found him in the vestry, gripping the edge of a table so tightly, the wood creaked. Even Silas Calder, far from the plantation, felt the ripples of unease. His bookkeeping became erratic. He lost sleep. One night he jolted awake, heart racing, certain he had heard knocking somewhere inside the house. Maria stirred beside him. "Silas, was that—" "No," he whispered sharply. "It was nothing. Go back to sleep." But it had not sounded like nothing. It had sounded like knuckles tapping rhythmically against wood, slow and patient, as though marking time. By midsummer, 2 more men had gone missing from the plantation. 1 field hand, 1 stable boy. Their disappearances were clean, without signs of struggle. The master forbade anyone from speaking their names aloud, insisting they had run away. But no one ran without taking food, or water, or each other. And no one ran toward the marsh, where the moon cast pale, trembling reflections and shadows moved with a will of their own. Through it all, the man in chains remained silent, except for the rare, chilling phrases he gave to Lila, or the Reverend, who refused to document anything he witnessed during prayer visits. But late one night, as Bellwether prepared to leave the property, he paused at the threshold of the storage building and whispered, "What are you?" The man lifted his head very slightly. "What is any man?" "You mock me," the Reverend breathed. "No, I remind you." Bellwether stepped back, horrified not by the words, but by the knowledge that part of his mind understood them. By the end of that summer, the unease had grown too large to dismiss as superstition. Something was happening on the plantation, something that touched animals, air, men, and the thin threshold between the living and the lost. And Charleston, though still unaware, was about to feel its first tremor of dread. Fear often arrives first as a feeling no one wants to name. By the autumn of 1843, that feeling had tightened around the plantation like a noose, slow, silent, and unseen. The marsh grasses along the Cooper River browned early that year, curling at their tips as if scorched by fire no one witnessed. The wind carried a strange scent at dusk, a sharp, metallic tang that reminded Lila of blood drying on iron. Even the riverboats passing the property slowed their pace, crews glancing uneasily toward the cypress-lined banks, as though expecting to see eyes gleaming back at them from the shadows. Word of the disappearances spread despite the master's attempts to bury them. The enslaved whispered before dawn and after dusk. The whites murmured behind parlor doors and in the back pews of St. Alistair's. Each group crafted its own explanations: murder, madness, spirits, rebellion. But the one possibility none dared voice openly was the one that pressed hardest against their thoughts, that the terror centered not on the vanished men, but on the solitary figure kept behind the locked door of the storage house. Lila watched him one evening from a distance, the way one watches a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. The overseer had opened the building to move crates, leaving the door ajar for a brief moment. Inside, the man sat in perfect stillness, chains coiled around him like a serpent at rest. The light spilled across his shoulders, revealing the faint, deliberate scars etched there. Each mark curved with impossible precision, forming patterns she had never seen but recognized instinctively as meaningful. Ancient, maybe. Heavy with some purpose. She should have looked away. Instead, she whispered, barely audible even to herself, "Why you here?" His eyes lifted. Not to her, past her, as though sensing something approaching from behind her on the wind. Lila startled and turned. Nothing, just the field stretching toward the fading horizon. When she looked back into the storage house, he had lowered his gaze again. That night, she dreamed of running water turning black. She dreamed of whispers rising through the mud like trapped breath. She dreamed of Jonah calling her name from beneath a surface she could not break. The next morning, her hands shook as she tied her apron. Meanwhile, in Charleston proper, Silas Calder grew gaunter by the week. His colleagues noticed the change. His hair thinning, his mouth pinched. his shirts hanging loose around his shoulders. But it was his eyes that troubled them most. Silas had always carried a hunted look beneath his calm exterior, but now he looked as though something had followed him home. He spent nights at his desk, relighting candles long after they had guttered into stubs. Maria often found him running his fingers over the very ledger entry he had tried so hard to forget. The scratched-out name, the note reading extremely dangerous, the date, 1843. One night she confronted him. "Silas, you haven't slept for days. What is tormenting you?" He shut the ledger quickly, as though she had caught him committing a sin. "The numbers aren't balancing, that is all." "You're lying to me," she whispered. "Something happened at the market." Silas's breath escaped him in a trembling sigh. "Maria, have you ever looked into someone's eyes and felt as though you glimpsed something that wasn't meant for you?" She stepped closer. "Whose eyes?" He didn't answer, but he rubbed his temples as though trying to erase a memory that refused to be erased. The truth was simpler and far more terrifying. Silas kept waking at the exact same time each night, sitting upright in bed as a phantom sound echoed inside his skull. A rhythmic tapping. A pattern. 2 knocks, a pause, 1 knock. He had tried plugging his ears, changing rooms, even sleeping at his office, but the knocking followed him. Patient and insistent, like a secret trying to teach him its alphabet. Shem. Reverend Bellwether fared no better. The more he prayed over the chained man, the more unsettled he became. His once thunderous sermons grew fragmented, punctuated by long pauses in which he stared at nothing as though reading invisible text in the air. Parishioners whispered among themselves, wondering if exhaustion had overtaken him or if he battled some private sin. But his assistant Caleb saw the truth in stolen moments. One afternoon, Caleb found the Reverend hunched over a stack of old manuscripts in the church library, texts written in languages Caleb could not recognize. Bellwether's fingers traced certain lines repeatedly, his face tight with dread. "Reverend," Caleb said softly, "you look unwell. Should I fetch a doctor?" Bellwether did not lift his gaze. "A doctor cannot mend the wound I fear has been opened." "What wound?" The Reverend hesitated. Then he closed the manuscript carefully, reverently, as though it might shatter in his hands. "In Scripture," he murmured, "there are warnings about doors between realms. Most believe these to be metaphor. I once believed that too." Caleb frowned. "Are you suggesting something has crossed into our world?" Bellwether's voice dropped to a tremble. "I am suggesting something has been invited." The assistant stepped back. A slow chill unfurled along his spine. The plantation owner, meanwhile, teetered on the edge of collapse. He had lost 3 laborers, suffered unexplained damage to his property, and endured sleepless nights filled with the unshakable sense of being watched. Even in daylight, he sometimes caught a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, shadows shifting, bending toward the storage building. His wife, pale and fraying at the edges, begged him to seek help from the city guard or from her brother in Columbia. "We are not safe here," she whispered one afternoon as they sat in the parlor, the curtains drawn tight though the sun blazed outside. He rubbed his hands together, knuckles white. "If I involve the guard, there will be questions. Questions I cannot answer. You must try. This house feels wrong. I hear footsteps in the walls." His breath hitched. "I hear them too." The plantation's enslaved population sensed the tension without being told.
The trunk had been sealed for
The workday
180
grew strained.
years. Its iron
Overseers
clasps
barked their
crumbling
commands
to
with frayed nerves, snapping whips not for discipline but out of fear. Nighttime brought no rest. Men and women lay awake listening to the wind creak through the shutters, wondering whether it was truly the wind. One evening, a child burst into Lila's cabin, tears streaming down her face. "Auntie Lila," she sobbed, "the river's whispering my name. Lila pulled her close. Hush now. Rivers don't whisper. The girl shook her head violently. But it did. It sounded like Jonah, calling me from the water. Lila swallowed hard. The air smelled strange again, like rain that never came. By late October, the plantation could no longer hide its unraveling from the outside world. A doctor arrived to examine the owner's wife, who had grown faint and withdrawn. The doctor's report was peculiar, describing her condition not as illness but as spiritual exhaustion, a term physicians avoided unless no natural explanation could be found. Neighbors noticed workers missing from the fields. Riverboat captains mentioned eerie lights glowing near the property at night, lights that vanished when approached. Someone whispered that the bellwether boy who delivered supplies had seen figures moving in the marsh, shapes that did not walk like men. And then came the night of the scream. Lila heard it first, a sharp, tearing cry ripping through the darkness, not from the quarters, not from the big house, from the direction of the storage building. She ran before she could think. Her feet pounded the earth. Others followed, lanterns in hand, faces pale and wide-eyed. As they approached, the plantation owner burst from his house, rifle shaking in his grasp. "Stay back!" he shouted, but no one obeyed. The storage house door hung open. The chain that bound it lay snapped on the ground, metal twisted as though by impossible force. Inside, lantern light revealed overturned crates, scattered straw, and, on the far wall, those strange symbols again. Not carved this time, drawn, smeared in something dark and still glistening. The man in chains was standing. Still restrained, yes, but standing in a way that froze every soul who witnessed it. His posture was rigid, yet his head tilted ever so slightly, as if listening to something just behind the gathering crowd. The scream came again, not from him, from somewhere in the marsh behind the building. The plantation owner and two overseers rushed toward the sound, rifles raised. Lila stayed where she was, trembling violently. She knew, deep in the place where intuition and dread intertwine, that Jonah's voice had returned, and it was not alone. Minutes later, the overseers emerged from the marsh, faces ashen. "What was it?" the owner demanded. Neither man could speak. One simply dropped his rifle, backing away until he collided with a tree. Lila caught sight of the mud clinging to his boots, a mud darker than any she had seen, thick and blackened like oil rising from a poisoned earth. From that night on, no one went near the marsh after sunset, and no one dared question the chained man again. He no longer needed to speak to be feared. The signs spoke for him. On the following Sunday, Reverend Bellwether abandoned his planned sermon. Instead, he delivered a warning so stark it echoed through Charleston for weeks. "There is a burden upon this land," he proclaimed, hands trembling on the pulpit. "One born not of wicked men, but of something older. If a door has been opened, we must decide whether to close it or step through." His congregation sat in stunned silence. In the back pew, Silas Calder listened with a face pale as winter ash. He recognized the knocking pattern hidden in the cadence of Bellwether's speech. Same rhythm, same message. The dangerous man was not simply a danger. He was a catalyst, and something had begun to move. What do you think, guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. Before the revelation comes, there is always a night when the air itself seems to hesitate, when every living thing senses the world tilting toward something it cannot understand. For Charleston in the winter of 1843, that night arrived with no warning at all. It began on the plantation, under a sky swollen with low clouds the color of iron. Lila had been sorting dried reeds in the quarters when she felt the first tremor. Not an earthquake, not a rumble, but a faint vibration in the floorboards, as if someone were dragging a heavy object across the earth miles away. The lanterns flickered. A pot rolled across the table and shattered on the ground. Children whimpered in their sleep. Then came the sound. A single resonant knock. From nowhere. From everywhere. 2 more knocks followed, spaced far apart, deliberate as the tolling of a distant bell. Lila froze. The rhythm was the same one Silas Calder heard each night, the same one Bellwether had unconsciously woven into his sermon, the same one that scratched itself into the plantation walls through hands that could not physically move. This time, everyone heard it. 1 knock. Pause. 2 knocks. Silence stretched across the quarters, taut as a rope ready to snap. And then the wind blew open the shutters, though the night outside lay utterly still. The enslaved surged out of the cabins, gathering in the yard, some crying, some praying, all staring toward the storage house. Its door, reinforced after the last incident, now stood open again, though no one had heard the latch give way. A lantern swung on its hook beside the entrance, its flame bending toward the interior as if drawn inward. Lila stepped forward, heart pounding. "Don't go near it," one of the men whispered urgently. She didn't answer. Something in her bones told her the moment had come, the moment Jonah had followed into the dark weeks earlier. The plantation owner and his overseers rushed from the main house, rifles raised. His wife hovered behind him, trembling so violently she clutched the door frame to stand upright. "Lila!" the owner barked. "Step back!" But she no longer listened to him. Her eyes remained fixed on the shadowed doorway. A voice floated out. Soft. Measured. Like a teacher instructing a child. "You should not open the door unless you are ready to walk through." It was the chained man's voice, but it wasn't directed at them. It was as though he spoke to someone just beyond sight. The owner hesitated, then motioned 2 men forward. "Light it," he ordered. "Bring the lantern in." They raised their torches and stepped inside. Silence clamped over the yard. The men did not call out. They did not move. They simply stood, facing the far wall. "Jonas," the owner called. "What is it? Speak!" No answer. Lila felt something cold stroke the back of her neck. She turned sharply, but nothing stood behind her. No person, no shadow. Just the wind, except there was no wind. A moment later, the 2 overseers walked back out into the yard with the slow, mismatched gait of sleepwalkers. Their torches burned low. Their faces were blank, their pupils wide and unfocused. They looked at the owner, then past him, then toward the marsh. "Did you hear it?" one murmured. The other nodded. "Yes, the calling." "What calling?" the owner snapped. "What's in there?" Both men turned toward him, eyes dull as extinguished coals. "It said your name," the first one breathed. "Said it clear." The owner stumbled back, horrified. His wife screamed. Reverend Bellwether arrived before dawn, summoned by a frantic rider. He entered the plantation yard wrapped in a wool coat, Bible clutched under his arm, face weathered by sleeplessness. The air felt heavier here, thicker somehow, as though filled with particles too small to see, but large enough to feel against the skin. Lila watched from a distance as the Reverend approached the storage house. "Who opened this door?" he demanded. No one answered. He stepped inside. The others waited, breaths held, lanterns dimming one by one, as if the night itself were swallowing the light. When Bellwether emerged, his hands trembled so violently, he nearly dropped his Bible. "What did you see?" the owner asked. The Reverend licked dry lips, unable to form the words at first. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. The chains. He shuddered. They were still fastened, but he was standing in the center of the room without touching them, as if they hung through him. That's impossible, the owner spat. Bellwether closed his eyes. I agree. Lila stepped forward. Reverend, what was on the walls? Bellwether's gaze drifted past her, unfocused. Not writing, not symbols. A map. A map of what? He swallowed. Of what waits beneath. The plantation owner grabbed him by the coat. If this is witchcraft, it is not witchcraft, Bellwether hissed, wrenching free. This is older than your faith or mine, older than scripture, older than men. The owner's wife began to cry, her hands shaking violently. Josiah, what is he? Bellwether looked toward the storage house, jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched. Not a demon, not a man, something in between. The owner's face tightened. Then we kill him. No, Bellwether whispered. If you kill him, the door he holds shut will open. Lila's breath caught. He holds it shut? Bellwether nodded once. But before anyone could question him further, a distant howl cut through the darkness, one long, rising wail that froze every soul in the yard. It came from the marsh, and it was not an animal. It was a human voice. The owner and his men rushed toward the marsh with lanterns raised. Bellwether followed. Lila hesitated only a moment before running after them. The wet ground sucked at their boots as they crossed the boundary between cultivated land and swamp. The trees closed around them like ribs around a heart. Every sound became magnified. The splash of their footsteps, the rustle of reeds, the rapid panting of their breaths. Then they found him. At first Lila thought it was Jonah. The figure was crouched by the water's edge, body shaking, clothes soaked. But when the lantern light hit his face, she recognized one of the missing overseers, the youngest, barely 20. His mouth hung open. His eyes stared blankly at the river. Boy, the owner shouted, grabbing his shoulder. Where have you been? The overseer didn't answer. He pointed with a trembling hand toward the water. Something floated there. A shape, a body. Lila's stomach lurched. The owner splashed in, dragging the form to shore. Mud and dark weeds clung to its limbs. When the lantern swung low, the light revealed the face. Jonah. Or what remained of him. His eyes had been closed gently, as though someone had tended him with care. But the skin across his chest bore the same precise markings Lila had seen on the chained man's shoulders, etched like deliberate script. The Reverend knelt beside the body, lips trembling with unspoken prayer. What does it mean? Lila whispered. Bellwether's eyes glistened. It means he was not taken. He was used. Used for what? The owner snapped, panic shredding his voice. Bellwether rose slowly, to keep the door from opening further. The owner's eyes widened. You mean, it requires a life? A sacrifice? A barrier, the Reverend whispered. A price the chained man refuses to let others pay. Lila stared in horror at Jonah's peaceful face. He didn't look afraid, she murmured. No, Bellwether said softly, because he understood, even if we do not. As they carried Jonah's body back to the plantation, a low hum drifted across the water, deep, resonant, familiar. The chain-bound man was singing, not a song of joy, not a lament, a chant, a warning, and a call. The owner rushed toward the storage house, rifle raised, wild with fear. Enough, I will end this tonight. As he approached the open doorway, the chant ceased. The silence that followed was unbearable, thick as fog, suffocating. Lila stood far behind him, watching with dread. Come out, the owner shouted into the dark. The man didn't move. But a voice rose from deeper within, not shouted, not spoken, carved into the air. "You should not stand there." The owner scoffed. "I'll stand where I damn well please," the Reverend shouted. "Stop!" Too late. The owner stepped across the threshold. The ground beneath him buckled. He screamed, a terrible, guttural sound, as the earth itself opened beneath his feet. He fell through the rotted boards, lantern crashing with him, his figure swallowed by darkness. His wife screamed. The overseers rushed forward, but Bellwether blocked them with both arms. "No, if you follow him, you will not return." From the pit rose a sound none of them would ever forget, a wet, whispering chorus, like reeds rubbing together underwater. Something moved down there, something vast. The Reverend staggered back, clutching his chest. Lila grabbed his arm to steady him. "What was that?" she gasped. "The door," he whispered. "The door he has been holding closed, and now it has tasted blood." The chained man finally lifted his head. His voice carried through the storage house, calm and heavy as the tide. "This is the cost of your trespass." The owner's wife collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "What have we brought into our lives? What have we bought?" The man looked at her, not with hatred, not with sympathy, with inevitability. "You did not buy me. You bought the thing that follows." The Reverend dropped to his knees, trembling. "What follows you?" The man closed his eyes. "That which was opened long before me, and which must never be freed." For the first time, fear flickered in his expression, not of pain nor death, but of failure. "If you knew what lay beneath," he whispered, "you would pray for chains." His words rolled over the yard, cold as winter breath. The enslaved gathered behind Lila, huddled in fearful silence. The overseers stood pale and shaking. The owner's wife sobbed into her hands. Only Bellwether remained kneeling, staring at the man with horrified understanding. "You are not here to destroy us," the Reverend whispered. "Then why did you come?" The man opened his eyes. "I did not come." He lifted his chained hands. "I was brought here to keep it from coming through." A long, awful silence fell. Then Bellwether spoke the truth aloud, voice breaking. "God help us, we chained the wrong one." Lightning split the sky above them. Lanterns blew out. And from the open pit beneath the storage house came the sound of movement, slow, dragging, like something awakening. If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. Dawn did not come gently to the plantation the following morning. It crawled over the horizon like a wounded animal, dragging bruised light across the fields. Mist clung to the earth in heavy bands, thick enough to obscure the yard, the quarters, and the broken doorway of the storage house. Even the birds refused to sing. The world held its breath, waiting. Inside the great house, the master's wife had barricaded herself in her bedroom, whispering prayers until her voice frayed into hoarse murmurs. She had not slept. No one had. Lila, after tending the terrified children in the quarters, wandered toward the riverbank, unable to remain still. The sky above the marsh shimmered with a copper tint, unnatural and bruised. Her thoughts moved in circles, stumbling around the same impossible realization. The chained man was not the danger. The danger was the thing beneath them, the thing he held back by the sheer force of his presence, his scars, his rituals, his silence. But how long could one soul hold back a tide? When she returned to the yard, she found the plantation's remaining overseers clustered together like nervous cattle. They spoke in half-whispered fragments, none wanting to say the truth aloud. He knew the ground would give way. No man could have stood there like that and not flinched. That hole weren't just rot. Something moved down there. I swear it touched my boot. One man crossed himself repeatedly. Another held a flask in trembling fingers. Only Reverend Bellwether seemed composed, though his composure was brittle as glass. He stood near the storage house, hands clasped tightly behind his back, staring into the open pit with haunted eyes. The man in chains sat nearby, bound but upright, watching the hole with the steady patience of a sentinel. Bellwether approached him cautiously, as one might approach a wounded lion. "You said you were brought here," the Reverend murmured. "By whom?" The man did not immediately answer. His gaze remained fixed on the ground. "By those who knew what sleeps beneath this land," he finally said. "Those who kept the old ways, those who understood the cost of silence." Bellwether's brows knit. "Then why South Carolina? Why this plantation?" The man looked at him then, really looked, and Bellwether felt a tightening in his chest. "Because this soil is thin." Thin. The word alone was terrifying. Thin enough, the Reverend realized, for something to seep through. "Who carved the marks on your skin?" Bellwether pressed. "I did," the man replied calmly. "Why?" "To remind myself where the burden lies." Lila, who had crept close enough to hear them, spoke before she could stop herself. "What burden?" The man turned toward her, and for a moment she felt the same sensation she'd felt weeks earlier at the storage house, the sense that he was listening to something far away. "There are doors in this world," he said softly. "Some are carved from stone, some from blood, some from memory, and some—" His eyes drifted toward the pit. "Some are nothing more than a weak place in the earth, where what lies beneath presses against what lies above." Bellwether swallowed. "And your purpose, is to keep that door shut?" "Yes." The man's voice was dull with exhaustion. "But I cannot do it alone, not anymore." The overseers, listening at a distance, exchanged uneasy glances. Before anyone could speak further, a sharp cry rang out from behind the quarters. A woman screamed. The group rushed across the yard. Children scattered. Chickens fluttered out of the way. At the edge of the field lay a man, one of the enslaved, his body twisted unnaturally, as though he had fallen from a great height, but there were no trees nearby, no ladders, nothing he could have fallen from. Bellwether knelt beside him, face grim. "He's dead," he murmured. "But how?" Lila whispered. One overseer pointed with a shaking hand. "Look, his feet. Bare, covered in marsh mud. Black mud. The same substance found on Jonah." "He went out there," Lila breathed. "Last night. The marsh called him." The Reverend shook his head violently. "No man wanders into the marsh at night unless summoned." The overseer stiffened. "Summoned. By what?" "By him?" one asked, pointing toward the chained man. The man shook his head slowly. "I do not call. I only listen." Bellwether rose. Then something else called him. The plantation owner's widow stumbled from her porch, pale and hollow. "What more will it take?" she sobbed. "How many must die before this ends?" The man in chains turned his face toward her, not coldly, not cruelly, with sorrow. "As many as it takes," he said quietly, "until the door is sealed." The widow screamed and covered her ears. "You speak like a demon." "No," Bellwether whispered, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "He speaks like a man burdened with knowledge no one should bear." But the overseers were not convinced. Fear had twisted their grief into violence. "Enough," one growled. "Chain him deeper, away from the ground, away from the marsh. He's cursed this land." Another nodded. "If we drown him in the river, the evil dies with him." Lila stepped in front of the chained man without thinking. "You fools," she hissed. "He the only thing keeping us alive." One overseer grabbed her arm violently. "Don't you dare defend—" "Stop!" Bellwether thundered, voice echoing through the yard. The overseer released Lila. "This is madness," the Reverend continued. "Killing him will doom us all." "Then what do we do?" another shouted. "Pray, build a fence around hell." The man in chains lifted his head. "There is one way." The yard fell silent. Bellwether stepped closer. "Tell us." But the chained man did not look at him. He looked at Lila. "We must go beneath." Lila's breath hitched. "Into the hole?" "No." His eyes darkened. "Into the place beneath the hole." Bellwether frowned. "What lies under there?" The man answered with a single word. "Memory." It made no sense, and yet Lila felt her skin prickle. "What kind of memory?" she asked quietly. "The kind the earth keeps when men forget," he said. "The kind carved into bone long before your ancestors were born." Bellwether murmured, "A burial ground." "No," the man replied. "A prison." Lila shook her head. "A prison for what?" The man lowered his gaze. "For the thing that once wore the shape of a god." A hush fell. One overseer sputtered, "This is blasphemy." "This is history," the man corrected softly. "Older than your scriptures, older than your language, and older than the chains you place around me." Bellwether swallowed. "If it is imprisoned, why now? Why here?" "Because the earth shifts, because men have forgotten, because your plantation sits atop the thinnest place in this land." He paused. "Because when you brought me here, it felt me." Lila felt the blood drain from her face. "What must we do?" she whispered. The man's answer was calm and terrible. "You must go with me." "Down there?" Bellwether asked. "Yes." "Why us?" Lila whispered. "Because you have heard it," he said, looking at her. "And you have not broken." Bellwether hesitated. "And me?" "You already know too much," the man replied. "Knowledge binds you to this." The Reverend looked almost relieved, as though the burden finally had a name. The overseers protested. The widow cried. The enslaved muttered prayers. But the truth was a weight none could deny. The door beneath the earth had opened, and something had begun to claw its way toward the world of the living. If it reached the surface, the death so far would be a mercy. Finally, Bellwether spoke with steady resolve. "Then take us below." The man nodded once. "Unchain me." The overseers recoiled. Lila stepped forward, hands trembling but steady. Bellwether followed. The man extended his wrists, iron embedded deep in flesh, skin scarred by years of restraint. And in that moment, as the key turned, the earth trembled again. The door waited. And the descent was about to begin. The air inside the storage house thickened the moment the shackles fell away. It wasn't imagination. Lila felt it. Bellwether felt it. Even the overseers backing toward the door felt it. The released man did not stretch or rub his wrists. He simply breathed, slow and measured, as though reacquainting himself with a world he had spent years holding at arm's length. The iron cuffs hit the floor with a hollow metallic ring. A sound like a knell. Bellwether flinched. Lila steadied herself. The chained man, now unchained, rose to his full height, taller than she had realized, taller than most men she had ever known. His scars glistened faintly in the dim lantern light, rising like reliefs carved from clay. "Do not follow us," he warned the overseers and the widow. His voice had changed. Not louder, still soft, still calm, but resonant, threaded with something ancient. Something that made the lantern flames bow toward him in a slight, involuntary lean. One overseer spat. "If you leave this property, we'll shoot you." The man glanced at him. The overseer's rifle jammed in his hands without being touched. The man turned away without comment, as though the weapon's rebellion was merely the wind shifting direction. Bellwether whispered, "God be with us." The man looked at him. "Your God sleeps here." A shiver ran through the Reverend so violently his teeth clicked. Then, without waiting for another word, the man stepped toward the pit, a jagged cavity in the floorboards where the master had fallen the night before. Lila followed him. Bellwether followed her. The lantern light jostled across the walls as they descended the splintered edges of the collapse. The overseers remained above, but not by choice. They could not bring themselves closer. Something in the air pushed them back, held them trembling at the threshold like frightened children barred from a nightmare they did not wish to see. The man paused at the lip of the pit. A breath escaped him, almost reverent. "The soil remembers," he murmured, "even when men try to forget." Then he dropped down into the darkness. Bellwether hesitated only long enough to cross himself. Lila took the lantern and followed. The earth swallowed them whole. The pit opened into a narrow, sloping passage. Walls of compacted soil and clay packed so tightly they seemed sculpted rather than natural. Lila held the lantern high. Shadows crawled like insects along the edges. A smell rose from the depths. Not rot, not decay. Something older. Mineral, bitter. Like stone dust mixed with iron. "What is this place?" Bellwether whispered. "A memory," the man said. "You keep using that word," Lila murmured. "Whose memory?" "The land's." They walked in silence for several minutes, the passage twisting and widening. The air cooled with each step. Somewhere deeper inside the earth, a slow, rhythmic thrum pulsed faintly, steady as a heartbeat, heavy as a drum. Lila swallowed. "You hear it too?" "Yes," the man said. "It has been beating for longer than your history." "Is it alive?" Bellwether asked. The man stopped walking. He turned his head slightly toward the Reverend. "Everything that waits is alive." They continued. Soon the walls changed. Earth and clay gave way to stone, massive blocks fitted together without mortar. The architecture was wrong for the Americas, wrong for anywhere she had heard of. Wrong because each stone bore marks, etched lines, spirals, intersecting cuts, so precise they looked machined. Yet they were weathered, ancient. Bellwether reached a trembling hand toward one of the carvings. His fingertips hovered over the grooves. "Don't touch it," the man warned sharply. Bellwether froze. "These stones remember their purpose," the man continued, "and they do not welcome the uninvited." Lila whispered, "So we invited." "No," he said, "but you are necessary." They ventured deeper. The thrum grew louder, vibrating the stones beneath their feet. The lantern flame shrank and stretched, as though pushed by invisible currents. Finally, the passage opened into a vast chamber. Lila gasped. The cavern was enormous, cathedral high, its ceiling lost in darkness. The floor was uneven stone, broken in places, revealing fissures of black water far below. A circular platform rose in the center, carved with concentric rings of symbols she did not understand. Atop the platform stood a stone column, and, around that column, bones. Human bones. Old, brittle, arranged in spirals like offerings. Bellwether staggered back. "Dear God!" The man walked forward, undisturbed. This is where the first guardian stood. Guardians? Lila echoed. He nodded. Before your time, before your nations, before your languages, they bound the thing that sleeps, bound it with blood, bone, and memory. Bellwether forced himself to steady. What sleeps here? The man placed a hand on the central stone column. The stone warmed beneath his palm. A god, he whispered, but not yours. The chamber trembled. Bellwether stepped closer. You speak of demons. No. The man's voice was low, reverent. Demons are small things. This one was once worshipped, once fed, once loved, until it consumed too much. Lila felt the air tighten. Why is it trying to come back? She asked. Because hunger is a memory too, he said. The stone column pulsed faintly, responding to his touch. Bellwether swallowed. What must we do? The man turned to them. You must witness. Witness what? Lila asked. The truth. He stepped back. The carvings on his skin, curved lines, intersecting marks, began to glow with faint light, as though awakened by the chamber's energy. Lila stared, horrified and fascinated. The man said, This door is open because the bones paid long ago have turned to dust. The seal weakens. Something must be given to strengthen it. Bellwether stiffened. Given? Yes. You mean a sacrifice? The man did not deny it. Lila felt the lantern tremble in her grip. You said Jonah paid the price. Her voice cracked. You used him. I did not, the man said. The land did. Bellwether's voice rose. Then what prevents the land from taking another, or all of us? The man looked almost sorrowful. Nothing now. A deep rumble rolled through the chamber, like thunder underwater. The platform shook. Fine dust drifted down from the unseen ceiling. Cracks widened between the stones. Bellwether grabbed Lila's arm. We must leave. We cannot stay here. No, the man said firmly. If you leave, it will follow you. Lila froze. Follow? Us? Yes, it rises toward sound, toward breath, toward thought, toward the living. The thrum intensified. A new sound rose within it. Whispering. Bellwether covered his ears. What is that? The prayers of those who fed it, the man said. Long before your world was born. Lila felt her skin crawl. The whispers weren't in English. They weren't in any language she recognized. They slithered through her mind like cold fingers. Bellwether sank to his knees. I cannot... The man touched his shoulder and the whispers receded slightly. You came because you must understand, he said. Understand what? Lila whispered. That sacrifice is not punishment. He looked at her. It is mercy. Another tremor shook the chamber. Something moved in the deepest fissure of the stone platform. Not water. Something thicker, slow, alive. Lila staggered back. What is that? The man answered without fear. The first breath of a god that should never wake. Bellwether grabbed his arm. Then seal it. You said sealing is possible. It is, the man replied. But the seal requires memory. A life that knows the truth. A life freely given. Bellwether realized before she did. He turned to Lila, horrified. No. Lila shook her head violently. No, I ain't dying in this place. You misunderstand, the man said gently. Not you. He stepped onto the platform. Bellwether's eyes widened. You. I was brought here to die, the man said simply. To die in the right place, where my blood binds the door again. Lila felt her throat tighten. You're one of the guardians, ain't you? No, he murmured. I am their descendant, the last one who remembers the old markings, The last who understands the door. Bellwether clutched his arm. If you die, what stops it from rising again? My death will not stop it. He looked at the stone column, which now pulsed with the rhythm of a living heart. My death will lull it, long enough for your world to remain ignorant. Lila felt tears burning her eyes. She didn't know this man, not truly, but she felt the weight of his burden like a stone crushing her chest. You were sold, she whispered, chained, beaten, and all this time you carried this alone? Yes. Why? He smiled then, a quiet, weary, human smile. Because I wanted you to live. The chamber shook violently. Stone cracked. Water bubbled up in thick, oily waves. The whispers turned to growls, deep, ancient, resonant. Bellwether shouted above the rising noise, If we do nothing, it rises, the man said. And if you die, it sleeps. For how long? The man closed his eyes. A generation. Another rumble tore through the chamber, so loud the lantern shattered in Lila's hands. They were plunged into darkness. The man's scars glowed faintly, the only light. Go, he said softly. Lila shook her head. No. Go. Bellwether grabbed her arm. Lila, please. The floor buckled. Something enormous pressed upward beneath the stone. The man cupped Bellwether's cheek with surprising gentleness. Tell them the truth. I will, Bellwether whispered, tears streaking his face. He cupped Lila's hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. You have seen me without chains, he said. Remember that, not what they wrote in the ledger. I will, she whispered. He stepped backward onto the center of the platform. The glow from his scars intensified, lines of light weaving across his skin like a web, like a map, like a story written in flesh. He lifted his arms, and the earth opened beneath him. A column of blackness surged upward. The man met it, embraced it, let it envelop him. For an instant, the chamber was filled with blinding white light. The whispers became a scream. Then silence. The thrum stopped. The chamber stilled. The earth sighed. And the glow faded. Bellwether pulled Lila toward the tunnel. We must go before it settles again. Come, quickly. They ran, stumbled, crawled their way upward as stone dust rained around them. Behind them, the cavern dimmed. The door, the great, ancient door, closed. A life given. A god lulled. A world spared a truth it would never understand. They emerged from the pit gasping for air, filthy, shaking, half-collapsed onto the yard. The overseers stared at them as though they had risen from the grave. The widow stumbled toward them. Where is he? What happened to him? Lila felt a sob choke her. He gone, she whispered. He gone, and he kept us safe. The plantation was silent. Even the marsh seemed to hold its tongue. Bellwether lifted his face to the gray sky. God forgive us, he whispered, for not knowing him. Lila closed her eyes. And the earth beneath them, for now, was still. Charleston awoke to a winter thick with fog and rumors. The plantation where it had all happened stood unnervingly quiet, its fields subdued, its workers moving with a shell-shocked stillness. The absence of the master, swallowed by the earth itself, was explained away hastily as a tragic accident. The doctor who came to examine the widow wrote a vague report that avoided every question worth asking. The overseers gave contradictory accounts of the night, contradicting themselves even as they swore oaths on their Bibles. Those who pressed for clarity found themselves facing men who shook like leaves at the first mention of the marsh. The truth, as always, became the first casualty. A coroner's wagon came for Jonah and the others who had died. It left without ceremony, kicking up dust as though eager to erase its own tracks. The enslaved mourned quietly, gathering in small circles after dusk, humming low songs without words. Their grief was real. Their silence was survival. Lila walked among them as one carrying a heavy secret. She said nothing of the cavern, nothing of the ancient tremors, nothing of the man who had given his life to seal the door. But her eyes, those who knew her well, saw something different in them. A depth, a fear, and a strange, persistent strength. Within a week, newspapers across Charleston buzzed with talk of the plantation's misfortunes, but details were scarce. Editors relied on gossip, and gossip, scrubbed clean of anything supernatural, told only of a tragic string of accidents. A drowning here, a collapse there, a plantation owner dead due to unsafe building conditions, a widow too shaken to speak. Nothing more. Only one man refused to let the matter slip quietly between the pages of history, Reverend Josiah Bellwether. He delivered a sermon 2 Sundays after the event, an address so heavy, so charged with emotion, the congregation sat rigid in their pews. "Brothers and sisters," he began, gripping the pulpit until his knuckles whitened, "there are burdens carried in this world by souls we fail to recognize as holy. There are sacrifices made by the unseen, by the unloved, by the unfree, sacrifices that keep us from ruin, and we, in our blindness, bind those who save us. We condemn the hands that hold back the darkness." Several women gasped. A few men stiffened. Bellwether continued, "I tell you this not to frighten, but to warn. We must not cling to ignorance like a shield. We must not mistake chains for righteousness. We must not call danger what we have simply failed to understand." Murmurs rippled through the church. He closed with a verse not from Scripture, but from memory. His voice trembled. "There is a door in every heart and every nation, and blessed is he who stands before that door when others flee." He stepped down from the pulpit, visibly shaking. The whispers began before he reached the vestry. What is he saying? Has he lost his mind? Is this some abolitionist fever? God forbid the bishop hears about this. The wealthy families of Charleston, the Pinckneys, the Rutledges, the Middletons, did not appreciate mysteries. They especially did not appreciate sermons that painted the enslaved as protectors rather than property. Within days, Bellwether received a letter from the diocesan office subtly urging him to take a leave of absence. Rest, they called it. Recuperation. He refused. But the fire in him had begun consuming itself. His assistant Caleb often found him wandering the church late at night, tracing his fingertips along the walls as though searching for cracks. "What are you looking for, Reverend?" Caleb asked once. Bellwether paused, eyes hollow. "Reassurance," he whispered, "that the ground beneath us is still holding." On the plantation, life resumed in a strained, artificial way. The overseers worked with renewed vigilance, but their eyes darted at every unexpected sound. The widow rarely left her house. Some of the enslaved whispered that her hair turned white at the roots in a single night. Within months she sold the property and moved inland, far from the marsh. When the new owners arrived, the first thing they did was rebuild the storage house, filling the pit, replacing the boards, and sealing the ground with lime and stone. They dismissed the workers who spoke of tremors. They forbade any mention of the previous owner. They razed sections of the marsh, believing, wrongly, that cutting down the cypress trees would erase whatever lingered there. But the land never forgot. And Lila carried the memory like a second spine inside her. Hard, unbreakable, invisible. Some nights she woke gasping. hearing the faint echo of whispering in the earth. Other nights she dreamed of the man's final smile, the sadness in it, the weary acceptance, the strange peace. She whispered prayers for him even when she doubted any God had heard him for years. When abolitionists later came through the South interviewing formerly enslaved people, Lila gave them practical stories. Harsh ones, true ones. She never mentioned the cavern, never mentioned the chanting, never mentioned the truth she had witnessed beneath the earth. But once, when an interviewer asked if she had ever known a man who frightened even the white overseers, she paused. Her gaze grew distant. "Yes," she said quietly, "but he weren't a danger to us. He was the danger to what was under us." The interviewer didn't understand. They wrote it down anyway. As for Silas Calder, he did not survive the year. News of the plantation tragedies circulated through Charleston's merchant class, and though every telling differed, one detail remained constant. Silas had brokered the sale. He had looked into the man's eyes. He had felt the fear first. Maria found him one morning sitting at his desk, candles long burnt out. He was upright, face calm, hands folded neatly over the ledger. At first she thought he had simply fallen asleep, but when she touched his shoulder, he toppled sideways like a toppled statue. No struggle, no mark, no sign of violence. The doctor declared it heart failure, quick and merciful. Maria did not believe it. She insisted he had died of fear, a fear he carried silently from the moment he processed that cursed sale. She later told her sister that Silas had begun hearing knocking again the night before he died. Not outside the house, inside the walls, and always in the same rhythm. Bellwether lived long enough to write a single incomplete treatise, hidden in the drawer of his desk after his death. His successor found it years later. The manuscript was titled, "On the Hidden Thresholds Beneath Our Feet." Most of it was theological conjecture, references to ancient cults, forgotten rituals, the nature of sacrifice. But one paragraph stood out. It read, "There are some born to carry a burden the world mistakes for wickedness. I have seen such a man. I have knelt before him, and if there is any justice in heaven, God himself wept when we bound him." The bishop ordered the document burned. Caleb did not obey. He hid the pages in a hollow beneath the church floorboards. They would not be found again for 117 years. Charleston moved on, at least on paper. The plantation changed hands twice more before the Civil War. The legend of the dangerous slave resurfaced occasionally in tavern tales and whispered gossip, but no one connected it to the disappearances or the tremors or the screams heard across the marsh. History prefers tidiness. It files away what cannot be explained. But the land remembers. Families who later farmed the property reported strange vibrations beneath their fields every 20 to 30 years. Wells dug too deep sometimes collapsed into caverns no one could map. Livestock refused to graze near the old storage house site. Children claimed to hear humming from the ground at night. Most chalked it up to superstition. But every few decades, the marsh water turned black for a single day. No one ever offered an explanation. As for Lila, after emancipation, she moved north with her children and lived quietly into her 70s. Before her death, she told one granddaughter a story no one else ever heard. It ended with these words, "Sometimes the world gets saved, child, but don't nobody know who did the saving. Sometimes the hero ain't the one who looks safe. Sometimes he the one you was taught to fear." Her granddaughter asked, "What was his name?" Lila closed her eyes. "He had one," she whispered, "but the earth kept it." And she never spoke of him again. The echoes of that winter in 1843 did not fade. They didn't vanish into the soil the way storms and seasons do. They lingered, quietly, invisibly, threaded through Charleston's memory like a half-remembered hymn. And though the names involved were eventually softened, altered or erased by the city's respectable scribes. The shockwaves of what happened on that plantation radiated outward for years. Newspaper archives from the early months of 1844 show a pattern that historians rarely piece together. A spike in anonymous letters to editors. A rash of sermons across the city warning of spiritual vulnerability. And an unusual number of property transfers among families who swore their holdings had become ill-favored by the Lord. Charleston, ever reluctant to admit fear, disguised it beneath piety and commerce. But beneath the surface, something trembled. The plantation, sold only weeks after the master's disappearance, became the subject of quiet speculation among the elite. Its new owners, the Markhams, were known for their practical sensibilities and scorn for superstition. Yet their letters, preserved accidentally in an estate archive, tell a different story.